Welcome to the Genetics Podcast. I'm Patrick, the co-founder and CEO of Sano Genetics. I'm really excited today to have Elin Haf Davies on the show. She's the CEO of Aparito, which is a technology company that focuses on patient-generated health data. They're working on a number of exciting clinical trials, mainly focused in rare disease. Elin's also an inspirational speaker. She's rowed across the Atlantic. She's a career as a pediatric nurse, and the list goes on from there, rugby player. So welcome to the show, Elin. It's really great to have you. Before we get on to your work at Aparito, I'm also a rower, so I just wanted to ask, I just couldn't imagine how long it would take to row across the Atlantic. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, it was, I guess it was one of those life-changing moments. My life prior to that had been all around rugby in terms of my sports adventures. So for 10 years, I'd combined my career as a children's nurse with playing Premiership rugby at London Wasps and Welsh students squad, and also the senior Welsh squads, getting 13A caps. And for 10 years, it had been sort of a great combination. And then I was dropped from the Welsh senior squad, went through a divorce, and just decided that I would row across the Atlantic, which, was a sort of brave decision, I guess, given that I'd never rowed before, never been out to sea before, and certainly didn't have the sponsorship money to fund the campaign at that time. But it was a very life-changing moment, and very proud and pleased that I decided to do it.
So, right. So you and a colleague, also a nurse, the two of you rowed across together, right? And how long did it take?
Yeah, so Herdip Sidhu and I'd worked at Great Ormond Street Hospital together for a few years, and we launched the campaign called Nautical Nurses. So we took 77 days to row across. I mean, it was sort of 12 years ago now, where we were in the classic rowing boat. And of course, ocean rowing, like many other sports, has sort of become unrecognizable now in terms of the boat designs and that kind of thing. But at that time, it was quite, and given that we were both complete novice rowers or sea goers, we were quite excited about the fact that we managed to get across. But more importantly, we'd also raised £190,000 for metabolic research at Great Ormond Street Hospital, which funded Dr. Emma Footet to do a PhD looking at the value of vitamin B6 in neonates with PNPO deficiency, a rare disease. We could have never guessed or anticipated that the value of the row could have contributed to that.
Yeah, and we were discussing this earlier, but the waterfall effect, or the knock-on effect that this can have of starting a research program that might not have otherwise been funded and leading on from there, the impact can be many times what you all originally set out to raise.
Yeah, definitely. It's like casting a stone, and like really the rippling effect, and went on to fund new formulation development, EMA orphan designation, and some protocol assistance. So we could have never imagined, and it was very exciting to see that our row, which was in some ways a sort of personal adventure, had that impact too.
Right. So then I guess after you finished the row, you went back to your normal life as a pediatric nurse, and you're working as part of clinical trials, right? In primarily in rare disease.
Yeah. So for about 6-7 years prior to the row, I'd been working in a role looking after children recruited to clinical trials. So I guess in total it was around 20 different clinical trials across 4 different therapeutic areas. And I'd got to see firsthand the challenges of supporting patients through clinical trials in a way that actually leads to meaningful outcome. And to be honest, after the row, I actually then went to work for the European Medicine Agency, because the pediatric regulation had been implemented. And I really saw that as an opportunity to influence the clinical trial design before
Right.
they even reached the patient. Because, as I say, I'd had that first-hand experience of seeing the challenges of conducting clinical trials in pediatrics and rare diseases.
So let's get into some of those challenges. What were the things that you observe back then, maybe that you tried to change with the EMA, and what are some of the challenges we still have today with clinical trials, especially in children?
Yeah, I mean, as I say, it was sort of 18, 19 years ago now since that first clinical trial experience I had. And I would say that, even today, the biggest challenge that we end having is selecting the right endpoint or outcome measure. And that has so many different sort of long-term or sort of, implications from that first question of which outcome measure or endpoint to select. On one level, if you don't select the right endpoints or outcome measures, it means that you then set yourself on a path to be constantly measuring the wrong thing. And when that does not reflect what's important to the child and family, then, the path just takes you further and further away from what's important. Secondly, I would say that unless you can find an outcome or an endpoint assessment that's sort of not time consuming, not painful, not invasive, that is age appropriate and disease specific, then the quality of the data that you get is also impacted because the child or the patient's ability to comply with it, it impacts the data quality in that regard. And then, the third part, of course, is this patient-centric point of view of dragging patients and families to hospitals that very often can be very long drives or long travels away, and all the stresses that comes with that.
Yeah, and so one of the examples I've heard you use before for a patient outcome as part of a clinical trial that's pretty frequently used is the 6-minute walk test in Duchenne muscular dystrophy and many other neuromuscular disorders. Would you mind just going into that example and why that's maybe not the best way of measuring progress, or the, I guess, the progression of symptoms of a child and whether a child is improving it?
Yeah, so as we know, the 6-minute walk test was actually designed for adults with cardiovascular disease, and certainly not necessarily designed for children with neuromuscular diseases. So the concept of asking children to walk for 6 minutes up and down a 25-meter lap is sort of bizarre from offset, really, particularly if you think that 6 minutes is a very long time to maintain a child's attention when they often have learning difficulties or some, neuro involvement that affects their behavior, if you like. But we also know that children can be trained by their parents to walk at a certain pace so that they meet certain inclusion criteria. They can be motivated to walk faster and further by paying them. And so, that test doesn't have the value and certainly doesn't then reflect what's important to patients and family on a day-to-day life of living with the disease.
So how do you see technology as helping this? What are you working on, or what are other people working on to maybe do this differently?
Yeah, the world of clinical trials really haven't, changed in a way that we know that, you know, digital technology has completely transformed the way that we do every other aspects of our lives, but
Right.
actually not the way that we evaluate uh, drug efficacy, effectiveness, and provide care. And so, we've been able to collaborate with the French company Sysnav in the development of their ActiMyo wearable device is one example. And we're working with quite a few other wearable devices as a means to see, could they be one tool in the armory, if you like, or one piece of the jigsaw that can add, the detail to the day-to-day life that these children are living without causing too much burden and sort of stress for them.
Right. So maybe if we think about the big picture for a second, could you paint me a picture of how you would, if you could start from scratch and redo the way that clinical trials are done, besides maybe, replacing one thing with a wearable device, how would you remodel the whole system? What are the other pieces that we could change to make this better and ultimately improve the way that we can get new drugs to help people?
Yeah, we've sort of heard the word patient-centric trials for quite some time now, but I don't think we've really started implementing them. And for me, this is going to require the putting together a lots of different tools and enablers, and one of those is to consider decentralized or remote clinical trials. Now, obviously, there will be some drugs or some mechanism of action, such as gene therapy, that is inevitable that the child needs to, be hospitalized or attend some hospital visit. But actually, what we don't need to do is drag, children and families to hospitals to complete paper-based questionnaires.
Right.
And even at some times we could organize for nurses to visit the child at home to perform some tests, and reduce the burden. So I strongly think that a couple of the big changes are going to be a more patient-centric clinical trial design, with the option for patients to have a lot of these tests and assessments done remotely at home, using things like wearables and videos and photos to capture important information in real time. And that kind of adaptive pathway based on those data analysis that will be sort of much more detailed and continuous will give us hopefully earlier access to medication in a safe way, but most importantly, an effective way.
Yeah, and I guess another thing that I can think of is, so I come from a rare disease genomics background, and one of the big challenges in rare diseases is even getting a picture of what typical development looks like for a child with a particular disorder. So you could also use your technology to understand what is life likely to be like, and that, I guess, also gives you a better picture of whether the treatments are helping, right? Because you can establish a much richer baseline to say most children with this mutation develop in a certain way, and treating them improves it or doesn't improve it in some kind of more specific way.
Yeah, so I kind of describe it as the digital phenotype, if you like. We know that these diseases, even those with the same genotype, have got a very heterogeneous phenotype, both in presentation and in progression. And that then obviously makes it really difficult to design the studies and select the right endpoint when you might have a multiple different, multisystemic disease, where not all aspects impact on every single child. So the way I see it is by developing these sort of digital phenotypes, so a description of what the patient's day-to-day picture looks like, can then far better inform this sort of genotype-phenotype correlation as well.
Right, absolutely. So would you mind talking through one or two examples from your work at Aparito? I know you've worked with the French company that you mentioned earlier. What did that project involve, and what were you able to do?
Yeah, so actually that one was a sort of a unique one in the fact that we mainly worked as regulatory advisors to support them in an EMA qualification of that wearable device, or the parameter that was generated by the device. It's quite
Right.
important to distinguish that it was sort of the stride velocity centile that was actually qualified by the regulator, not necessarily the device itself. And so, we were able to collaborate with the clinicians to see the study data, and propose it to the regulators in a way that had the qualification for considering it as a secondary endpoint at this time, but also with a clear indicator from the regulator of what additional data they would need to see it being moved to a more primary endpoint basis.
Right. So I guess there's a whole set of challenges here around even just getting regulators to recognize that this is a viable way to measure disease progression.
Yeah, but interestingly, it's not the regulators that are most risk averse here. The regulators have, for quite some time, been asking for new, more innovative ways to monitor. The problem has been, and it's one of my major frustration, if you look at how much money we're investing in, amazing technology such as gene and cell-based therapies, CAR T, fantastic innovation, and yet when it comes to the proportion of investment and validating new outcomes to measure the effect of those, it's tiny, and I can't understand myself the logic of investing so much money in developing a new therapy to bring it to clinical trials, but not even considering the kind of matched or relevant validation of an endpoint to go with that. And if you look at Actimio and their work in developing that wearable device in Duchenne muscular dystrophy, the majority of that work was actually supported and driven by the patient group community themselves and key opinion leaders. And so, there is, I think, a sort of real appetite by the regulators to get these things come through, to have early co-development with patient groups, but there is risk aversion from the pharmaceutical companies in adopting more innovative study designs for their precious sort of assets, if you like.
So is it sort of maybe a conservatism where they're more concerned about something maybe going wrong and not getting approved because the new measure isn't is as well understood or validated? Is that kind of how you see it?
Yeah, for sure. And that I certainly would not be advocating to be reckless and use the completely unvalidated endpoint for a clinical trial. But we've now seen enough experience of validated biomarkers and how you go about investing in validating those biomarkers that we could actually be applying the same approach, the same methodology to validating other measures in a way that we can bring them into the study design much, much earlier.
So how do you, when you start a project with a patient group or with a researcher or pharmaceutical company, how do you go about actually designing the measure? Do you run focus groups with patient organizations or patients themselves? Do you draw off of body of research from academic or pharmaceutical researchers? Or how do you actually go about saying, from we know that there's a better way to do this using technology to actually developing the technology, whether it's wearable or a mobile device or whatever it is?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it varies. It depends a lot on. So, for example, our work with the International Gaucher Alliance, which is a very, big, very well-established, well-informed patient group, has involved a lot of patient group, focus groups, in-depth interviews, online surveys, because the patient group was able to support and facilitate that. Other patient groups, they tend to be slightly smaller if they're early on, and so they don't necessarily have the same sort of resource or infrastructure to support that. So we do slightly smaller involvement, but it's absolutely mandatory today to get that early input for sure.
Yeah, I mean, when you were just talking about the concern about trials failing, it made me think of an example. We had a Nick Serow on a previous episode of the podcast, who's part of a large group of people who've recently had a successful clinical trial for a rare disease called AKU, and they found that an early trial actually did fail for the same molecule, failed because the endpoint they were measuring was just really not reflective of improvement of the disease, and they developed a score to measure improvement of the disease, and it's as a direct result, they've had a successful clinical trial. And I think the other lesson from that story is the involvement of so many different parties, which it sounds like you embrace as well. It's not just a company or a pharmaceutical company on their own, but patient groups, patients themselves, new technologies coming in, and ultimately the pharmaceutical companies that have the expertise to develop the treatments and then bring them to market.
Yeah, it has to be a multi-stakeholder sort of input, and I would go further and say we need to give patients and the patient community the support and the resources to lead the way on this, because we can obviously advise on regulatory strategy, validations, qualification, but actually we should be there to be advisory and funding resources on this to enable patients to do it, not which unfortunately happens sometimes, that you do it a bit more tokenism, that we've already charged along the way, and then we turn to the patients to say, well, do you want an apple or an orange? And they go, well, actually I'd really like
Right.
a banana, so why didn't you offer me
Yeah, 2 years ago before you started.
exactly. So that's where I think there's still a bit of work to do in changing a bit of mindset on that.
Do you think also your approach can be used in determining whether treatments are working or are cost effective after a treatment's already been approved? I mean, I'm thinking in the UK, for example, there's a number of expensive drugs that are coming on the market, and it seems like the NHS needs better ways to ensure that they're getting value for what they're paying for. Is this also an area that you're thinking about or working on, where you say after a child has had a treatment, can we work with the family or monitor the progress in some way to make sure that if the government's going to pay £1 million for a potentially transformative treatment, that we actually really understand how this is impacting the life of the child and the family?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. But just to be clear, to go back to the point I was trying to make about the choice of endpoint of outcome earlier, by selecting the wrong endpoint or outcome for the clinical trial, you're setting yourself on a pathway
Right.
which
To
takes you
failure.
further and further away from this question. And that's where in these study designs, if we understood what was important to patients right from the beginning, and yes, the regulators have a very clear mandate to be evaluating efficacy and safety, and the reimbursement agencies have a very clear mandate to be evaluating effectiveness and value. But actually those two things aren't completely mutually exclusive. If you could consider those things in one right at the beginning, again patient sort of driven, then we would have far better data and understanding collected through the initial clinical trial study designs by the time it came to the regulator. And it shouldn't then have to be let's panic, we don't have the right data for
Right.
our HTA application now, because we hadn't thought about it till now.
Do you feel like there's a lot of support from governments in the UK and Europe to push towards this kind of technology? Is that a champion sort of in your corner of helping you to get these things to market faster and to reshape it this way?
I wouldn't say it's a difficult one. I think the NHS, but also like a lot of healthcare providers around the world, I don't think it's unique to the UK at the moment, are really struggling to provide the healthcare that's required for all the different, kind of health requirements of today, from, preventative medicine to
Right.
vaccinations to, resistance to antibiotics to neglected diseases that are now global health impacts, not sort of developing world neglected disease impact that we currently think of them are. And then we have a very aging population. And so healthcare providers are having to go through a really difficult time in balancing their, spending. And yes, they are always looking for solutions to manage that, but it's a difficult time for them to manage the sort of day-to-day firefighting they're experiencing today and looking after
Yep.
today's patients versus the investment for future ones. And that's where I think the two kind of conflict, I think.
Right. Yeah. It has to save money immediately. It can't just save
Hmm.
money in the long term.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Do you see any kind of solution to this insight? I mean, it seems like every year the concerns about rising costs, certainly in the US and here in the UK as well, seem to get worse and worse. Are we headed for some kind of crisis and we'll have to figure out how to reset? Or do you see do you see some kind of turnaround or solution on the horizon?
I mean, sadly, I worry that we're more likely to see a bit of a crisis before we see resolution
Right.
on this space. It is difficult to see. We know that we've got 7,000 rare diseases and the number growing every day, and yet we've only got, in Europe, I think 170 odd drugs now on the
Right.
market. So only 5% of the rare disease community that we know have got treatments available at the moment. And at the same time, we know that it's not sustainable to fund the currently one available, let alone consider drug access and support for the others. And so the orphan regulations and the incentivizations linked to it have been, successful in getting pharmaceutical companies interested in this space. But let's not be sort of naive and think that they are investing in rare disease because of uh, philanthropic reasons. They're also
Yes.
there for profit. And this profit margin without the transparency and the demonstration of value is not sustainable. Certainly not in the current global kind of climate and political uncertainty. And so I do think it's quite an uncertain future for this area, that needs to really see it as a societal global issue and not a dog eat dog kind of future.
Yeah, absolutely. There's this, and a lot of people have probably heard of Moore's law, which is the idea that computing power gets faster and cheaper by a factor of two every year and a half or so. And I've heard the opposite. It's just called Eroom's law, which is the cost of drug development doubles every 2 or 3 years. So it's unsustainable in that sense. So I know
Hmm.
there are other approaches out there, drug repurposing, to take things that have already been approved and try them out in new conditions where we already know it's safe. It seems like this is an area where groups like yours could make a really big impact, because if you're working with the patient groups early to understand what is success look like, and you're able to take something that is already proven safe and try to accelerate it through the development process. Is this an area that you're already working in or thinking about?
Yeah, so I wrote a paper with Professor David Hughes on the opportunity here for repurposed drugs to be developed and to offer an opportunity for the rare disease community in an affordable way. But sadly, you still have very aggressive pharmaceutical companies that then jump on this and rebrand them in an orphan drug and charge them back to the same community at 10, 50, 60% higher than they were when they were
Right.
available in a different format. So even that as an approach sadly gets sort of capitalized for profit making purposes. And again, in the rare disease space, there are examples where generically available kind of, I call them cheap drugs, were available and then put through the orphan regulation process and now are not affordable to the same
Right.
community that supported the development of them.
So it seems like the payers, the NHS in the UK or insurance companies or healthcare providers in the US have to step in at some point, right? To make it fair for everyone, right? I don't think anyone would argue that the pharmaceutical companies shouldn't be able to make money because they're doing an important and expensive and risky part of the process. But equally, if it's as you say, if it remains unsustainable, then it's not doing anyone any good.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you have a slightly more optimistic and favorable view of the pharmaceutical industry in that regard. I think the European Commission have had a big workshop on this issue in terms of the incentivization for pediatrics and orphan drugs. I mean, the pediatric regulation had very different incentivization and yet has not seen the same success as orphan drugs
Right.
because of that. And who would argue that pediatric health is not something that as a society we should be investing in? And there are, I think, global political issues that governments need to collaborate with globally, because at the end of the day, drug development, and we live in a globalized world, is a global issue to sort of make this a fair balance. And yes, profit, but profit that's sort of transparently kind of understood on margin, that really reflect what the R&D investment that has been done by the pharma company itself, not necessarily done by government funded hospitals and government funded grants, and then acquired by pharma company to take the last leg, if you like.
Yeah, you make a really good point there, that it's often difficult to track exactly how much of the investment was made by each of the different parties, because so many of these innovations go through many years or decades of government funding in the form of grants and other sorts of things.
Yeah, definitely. And it's not to say that equally pharmaceutical companies have assets that fail, and they've invested in 5-10 years of phase 1, 2, 3 toxicology formulation development, and then it fails in phase 3, as we know, for a large majority of these. But it's still not always justifiable and transparent in a way that we can see it to be sustainable.
Yeah, well, and I think also we need a model as well that doesn't just incentivize treatment after we're sick, but that incentivizes maintenance of health in some way. And I know it's very tricky to think about from a business model perspective of who would pay for that and how you go about doing it. But it just seems like the idea that if we take a common condition like diabetes or cardiovascular disease more generally, that the vast majority of the money is spent treating people after they have the condition, not in prevention or early detection, because the money is in treatment, not in these other areas. So I know some in the US, for example, there are innovative healthcare providers like Kaiser Permanente, I think, is an example where they are both the healthcare provider and the payer, so they can make some they can make some drastic changes to focus on prevention, because at the end of the day, it's them they're not being paid based on the number of butts in hospital beds, or they stand to save money that way. So I wonder if some of these kind of models will start to emerge as well.
Yeah, no, I think that there is an exciting opportunity to bring new models. And I think, across business everywhere, people are now thinking, what used to be called the triple bottom line or CSR or sustainable thing, those aspects, in a way where you have climate change and limited resources, we need to come up with more interesting sort of sustainable, ethical, longevity kind of approaches.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know we're running short of time here. Just to close out, is there if you had the ear of I don't know if any government official can do any of this right now, but if you had, let's call it a magic wand to make a change in the industry that you think would improve things for the better, what would you try to do?
My passion, of course, is to invest far more in early development of patient-centric outcome measures that really reflect what's important to patients. So to sort of not leave these questions till late in the drug development pathway, and to really prioritize putting them very early as a priority. As early as we're doing the toxicology programs, as early as we're doing the manufacturing programs, let's get the patients to be setting the research agenda, identifying the outcomes that are important to them, and validating them very, very early in collaboration with the regulators and the reimbursement agencies.
Absolutely. Well, that sounds like something we can all get behind.
Excellent.
Great.
If only it was that easy.
Yeah, exactly. If only it was that easy. But I know something we're working a lot on. It's definitely something I can tell you're working on. So hopefully we can make some progress.
Yeah, definitely. Excellent.
So where can people keep track of you if they want to follow? You're on Twitter?
So Aparito Health on Twitter, and my personal handle, Elin Haf Davies. So yes, quite active on Twitter as the general updates, but also our website, www.aparito.com, which we are about to launch a very new updated one. So come back in a week or so to see what else we're up to in this space.
Excellent. Okay, wonderful. Well, thanks so much, Elin.
Thanks so much. Have a good one.
Have a good one.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.